What is a podcast really? Well, let's take a look at a few of the definitions here so that we can get an idea of what they are. To distribute over the internet, playback on a mobile device or personal computer. Podcast is a series of digital media files. Or the third one here, the delivered via RSS feed. In other words, a music or sound file delivered via an RSS feed that you could subscribe to. But for our intents and purposes and for our discussion, we're going to leave it a little more generic and say it's just an audio file that you can download or stream off the internet, anywhere basically, for educational purposes and in our case. One of the places that you can download this information or subscribe to podcasts or even upload your own podcast would be a place like iTunes here that we see. And that begs the question, why in the world do we even want to podcast? Why use this in the world of education? Well, one is for the students here, and the other one is for teachers. It has benefits for both the teachers and the students. So here are the benefits for the students. Basically, one of the biggest benefits would be lesson review. Let's say you're going over your lesson, you want the students to review what you just talked about. Let's say you've recorded it for them to listen to later. Obviously, it's a good way for them to review, even at home. Then you've got as supplemental material. For instance, let's say there's information that you couldn't get to during your class, or information that you just didn't have time for or couldn't allot for. You could obviously have this supplemental podcast waiting for the students to listen to as extra homework, as just filler material, whatever it is. Then there's the complementary material. Say, for instance, you tell your students to go in the back of the room and read one of their books. Well, instead of reading one of their books, they actually have a podcast series that narrates the book for them. So it's sort of a complement to what they were already going to be doing in the classroom. And then we've got the remedial help. This is absolutely a phenomenal way to use podcasting information. Let's say it's remedial for anybody with learning disabilities, all the way down to the individual that just doesn't have that as English as their native language, perhaps. Let's say they're from a foreign country and they just have a hard time hearing you. When you have a podcast of that same material, they can listen to it at a slower pace, review things, whatever they need to do in order to get that to work better. And obviously, podcasts can benefit language classes. If you're talking about language and learning languages, obviously having those languages, those voices, those intonations recorded is super beneficial. Then we've got the flat world influence here. In other words, students can access these from anywhere, anytime, and they are on the go. Podcasts make an impression on students. They are something new, something interesting, something to be at least sort of desired. So they make that impression, they keep students interested in what you're learning about. And obviously they add variety to the classroom. Hitting on and making sure that you touch all of the different learning styles in your classroom. And now, what are the benefits for teachers? Well, it breaks the monotony, just like we were talking about just a second ago. It adds variety. Well, it adds variety for the teacher as well. You don't have to do the same old thing over and over again. Is there a little bit of planning involved? Absolutely. This is the second point. It forces that preparedness. It forces you as a teacher to really think about how you want every step of the procedure to go, which can obviously be a good thing. It could be a little time consuming, but it's never a bad thing to be very prepared. Now we have easy self-reflection. If you're teaching a lesson, you can sit back later and think about how the class may have gone, but how much better could you actually reflect upon what you've done if you have it recorded and you can listen back to it, see how your materials were actually delivered, and really evaluate yourself. We've got models sophistication. This is tied back into what we talked about for the students section. It just means teachers look more sophisticated. They gain more respect, especially from the digital learner, if they're working in that student's digital world. Then we have think about learning styles. That just means that the teacher is forced to think about that specific learning style, that specific student that might really benefit from that, and really try to tap into those resources, those audio resources, into the audio learning style. Then we've got it's timeless. In other words, it's good today. it's good in a month from now, and you can reuse that podcast next year for that same lesson. So if you've already developed it, it's there forever. And then timeliness is related back to that flat world thing. You can use it any time. It doesn't matter when the student accesses it. They could do it in the morning, evening, afternoon. You could reuse it again and again and again, and from anywhere, anytime. So, how do you make your own? If it's truly useful, how do you go about making your own? Well, first thing you need to do is get prepared, then you get organized, you get it all down to the same place, you get cutting it up and slicing it and editing it, then you get it done by you transcribe it, transcode it, you create a single file out of it, and then when you're done with that, you blast it out, you make sure that you get heard, that your students hear you at least. So here's the first step, getting prepared. In order to get prepared, truly prepared to create a podcast, you have to choose a topic. That seems like a no-brainer. But then you have to really narrow that focus down. You might be talking about Civil War, but you've really got to narrow that down to one specific topic in order to make this work very fluidly, like the Battle of Antietam, or even a little snippet from within that. Now we're talking about, once we have that focused topic style, now we can actually create 2 or 3 main points from that, much like we would with a lecture or a speech in speech class. Finally, one of the last things you need to do is make sure that you have like a theme or a mood in mind. Is this going to be a funny, or is this going to be a serious, or is this going to be a more intellectual version of this podcast, or is this going to be more of a lighthearted version? So that when you start picking out your music, you can decide on what kind of music, what kind of theme you really want this to ride out. Once we've actually become familiar with our topic, once we actually have chosen our topic, now we need to start organizing things. And the most important part about this organization is to actually make sure that you have your entire storyline, your storyboard all put together. So getting organized is just super, super important, as this first point says. First thing you need to do, it's the thing that sets the framework, the foundation for the entire podcast. If you are not organized, things are not going to go well for you. So one of the best ways to organize all of your materials and make sure that everything is put together in a succinct, logical manner is to create a storyboard or timeline or storyline, something along those lines, basically something that gives you some framework to follow. Then once you've created that framework, you just start grabbing all your stuff. You get your sound files, you get your music files, and you start just pulling things in. You start organizing those different sound files together so that later on you can edit them. Here's an example of a storyboard. Now granted, it's for a video, so it's got a little different flavor than what you're going to be using. This is for a Simpsons cartoon, obviously, but notice how it has each individual frame planned out ahead of time so that they know what order everything is going to fall into. You can make a very similar storyboard for a podcast, and you actually have to do less work because you don't even have to draw necessarily. For instance, you could take something like this, which is the board of these different pieces that are put together to show you what's involved with the story over there on your right-hand side. This is a story of Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red was a skater girl, and so the first section right here is how it all begins. The second section, as you can see, is the middle, and then the third is the ending. And obviously each one of these would be your 2 or 3 topical or subtopical headings that one bleeds into the other. And let's pretend like those little white arrows are the transitions that go through them. And you can add as much detail or as little detail as is necessary for you. Now the nice part is that, like I said before, storyboards are not the exact way to go. You could use the storyboards like you see over here, or you could use something more like a timeline right here down at the bottom, or you could even just use a regular old outline to get your point written down, to get it all organized. You just need a structure, a foundational structure that will help you get started. And that's what you're going to focus on when you are beginning your final project. You're going to start using some sort of framework that will help you build your concept. So you're going to pick your topic, narrow it down, start creating your 2 or 3 subtopics, and you're going to start laying out what's going to take place in your final podcast. This ends part 1 of the video series.